I think if you ask a lot of Miami Dolphins fans who the greatest steal in NFL draft history is in their franchise, they might say this man right here, wide receiver Nat Moore. The Dolphins drafted the Florida wideout in the third round with pick number 78 in the 1974 NFL Draft, making him the last man taken in that third round, seeing as the Dolphins had the final pick in the round due to winning Super Bowl VIII the year before. By this point in the draft back in the 1970s, it's tough to find good contributors, due to the lack of scouting tools available, due to conflicting interests with other lines of work and other leagues, like the World Football League and the Canadian Football League, and due to a whole host of other factors. Heck, the man taken right after Moore and the man taken 2 picks before Moore never even played a single game in the NFL. But the Dolphins, needing some help at wide receiver with 2 of their top wideouts, Paul Warfield and Howard Twilley, on the wrong side of 30, decided to take Moore at that spot. What followed was an incredible career where Moore became arguably the greatest wideout in Dolphins history. Moore played 13 seasons in Miami and was nothing short of spectacular, catching 510 passes for 7,546 yards and 74 touchdowns, and being named a Pro Bowler and an AP First Team All-Pro in 1977, a year where he led the entire NFL with 12 touchdowns. By the time Moore's career was done, he was the all-time leader in franchise history in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns, and to this day, might be the greatest receiver in franchise history, as he ranks 3rd in receptions, 3rd in receiving yards, and 2nd in receiving touchdowns. Mark Duper and Mark Clayton were spectacular for the Dolphins later on, but Nat Moore might be in a league of his own when it comes to Dolphin wideouts for just how good he was. The 1974 NFL draft class for the Dolphins was not that good, as they really didn't get a lot of production out of their picks, despite having 5 in the top 3 rounds, and despite having 22 picks in total. But Moore was a heck of a player, and was the bright spot for Don Shula when he was picking his new batch of players. And there were a lot of great receivers from that 1974 draft class. You had 2 Hall of Famers for the Pittsburgh Steelers in John Stallworth and Lynn Swann. You had the leader in receiving yards in 1976 for the Baltimore Colts in Roger Carr. And you had a man who might be the greatest returner of all time and probably deserves a spot in the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Billy White Shoes Johnson. But Nat Moore was right up there with the best of them from that draft class, as he was a fantastic player who is remembered fondly today throughout both NFL history and Miami Dolphins history. However, the Dolphins were never supposed to take Nat Moore. Oddly enough, they had their eyes set on a completely different receiver early on in the 1974 NFL Draft, as they were originally supposed to take a 35-year-old? Right at the age where every NFL player back then was retiring, the Dolphins were going to take a chance on someone who was 35? Only 2 players in NFL history had even recorded 200 or more yards in a season at 35 years old, with those guys being 2 future Hall of Famers in Pete Retzlaff of the Philadelphia Eagles and Don Maynard of the New York Jets. And the Dolphins had their eyes set on a 35-year-old early on in the draft, going against all conventional wisdom, only to be bailed out in the end? Well, that's sort of what happened, and we're going to break down this absolutely bizarre draft story for you today. Because instead of drafting Nat Moore, this is the story behind the receiver that the Dolphins almost got of a 1974 NFL Draft in one of the biggest draft blunders in Miami Dolphins history that you've never heard of before. Be sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel, because we post every single day on here about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL and the NFL Draft. And we have a live stream every day as well. So if you like that sort of stuff, then this is definitely the place for you. Thanks in advance for your support and for liking and subscribing to grow this community. And with that in mind, let's talk about the supposed pick that was going to be anything but a win for the Fins. Before I talk about the actual incident in question and just how bizarre it was, we need some context to understand just who this man right here is, as in the man that the Dolphins were thinking of drafting. Apologies in advance for not having any highlights of him from his days in college football, seeing as this was the early 1970s, and footage from HBCU schools from that time period is basically non-existent. so I have to just use footage of his time with the NFL across the teams he actually played for, as in the Minnesota Vikings and the Buffalo Bills. This man right here is John Holland, and the wide receiver out of Tennessee State entered the 1974 NFL Draft as one of the top wideout prospects out there. Back in the first half of the 1970s, Tennessee State was one of the best small colleges out there for football, and was absolutely dominant at the Division II level. And a big reason why was the incredible play of John Holland, who finished his career with the Tigers with 108 catches for 1,622 yards and 22 touchdowns. For some perspective on how good Holland was, during that 1973 season, he recorded 11 receiving touchdowns, which was the most in school history at the time, with no player before him even so much as having double-digit touchdowns. His 22 career receiving touchdowns ranked first in school history by the time he graduated, and it's a mark that all these years later, with an expanded season and more emphasis on the passing game, has only been broken by 5 players. He led the team in receptions in both 1972 and 1973. The only other player at the time to accomplish this feat in program history was Johnny Robinson, who did it in the 1960s and was good enough to get drafted in the 2nd round by the Buffalo Bills and the 7th round by the Detroit Lions. For the level of competition that he played with, he was an All-American by quite a few publications over the years. And he was so good, so fast, and so dominant in college that he was expected to be a first-round pick, or at worst, a very high pick in the 2nd round. This was set to be a really good year for Tennessee State from an NFL draft perspective. Too Tall Jones was projected to go 1st overall, which he did when the Dallas Cowboys selected him. And linebacker Wayman Bryant was also projected to go incredibly high, being chosen 4th overall by the Chicago Bears. And offensively, John Holland was going to add his name to that list of high draft picks and Tigers making it in the NFL. And with that in mind, Dolphins head coach Don Shula wanted a piece of the action. The Dolphins were a heck of a team going into the 1974 NFL Draft, having won back-to-back Super Bowls and having represented the AFC in the previous 3 title games. However, wide receiver was definitely an area that they could improve upon. Yes, Paul Warfield was an AP first-team All-Pro in 1973 with his 11 receiving touchdowns. And yes, the Dolphins committed highway robbery on the Cleveland Browns when making that trade. But he was going to be 32 years old come 1974, and he was going to be on the decline. You had a couple of other guys who were trending older. You had rumors that guys could be jumping ship to the upstart World Football League by getting salaries that the NFL could not and would not compete with. So if there was a receiver that was going to be on the board that the Dolphins really liked, they were willing to pounce on it, as such a move could pay dividends both now and in the future. And Don Shula really liked the man that you've been watching this whole time, Tennessee State wideout John Holland. In fact, he liked him so much that he wanted to get to know him a little bit more and make him his personal guest at Super Bowl VIII. You might be thinking to yourself, wait a second, why would Don Shula be doing this before the Super Bowl? He's got a game to coach and a championship to win. Why is he focused on next season and entertaining a draft prospect this early? This is like if the Philadelphia Eagles invited Abdul Carter to be on the sideline for Super Bowl 59 with them. Well, remember that back in 1974, the NFL draft was held in late January, just a few days after the Super Bowl. It's almost like the NBA and the NHL today and how their draft is shortly after the finals are done. The NFL had a system like that throughout the first half of the 1970s. And yes, it felt incredibly rushed, and no, I do not want to go back to that whatsoever. However, with that in mind, Shula gave Holland a call. He somehow got his number, and he was ready to make the invitation. With a good visit, especially seeing as Holland was on the board by the time the Dolphins were on the clock with pick number 26 in the first round, it seemed like Don Shula was going to get his guy, and everything was going to go swimmingly. Except, all those stats I said earlier about John Holland, the numbers about him being one of the greatest receivers in Tennessee State history and an instrumental part in the success of the program, turns out they were all false. Everything I said was a lie. Sort of. At least when it came to the John Holland that Don Shula was looking at. Because you see, when Shula made that phone call to invite Holland to get to know him better in the pre-draft process, and invite him as his personal guest for the Super Bowl, Don Shula didn't call that John Holland. Instead, he called a completely different guy named John Holland. Because, you guessed it, Don Shula called the wrong number. He told John how impressed he was with his skill set, and how he wanted to draft him, and how he would be a great addition to the team. The only problem? He called the 35-year-old steelworker by the same name. The wide receiver from Tennessee State resided in Middletown, Ohio. The 35-year-old steelworker also resided in Middletown, Ohio. This meant that there were two guys named John Holland who lived in Middletown, Ohio, and they were not related to each other. Two guys in the same town with the same name, completely by coincidence. And Shula got a hold of the wrong one. He got the wrong number. As the steelworker Holland said upon Shula's request to join him at the Super Bowl and play in the NFL, I had to tell Don I didn't think I would last very long. I had to tell him, I'm not the John Holland you're looking for. These are not the droids you're looking for. This is not the John Holland you're looking for. Oddly enough, it's not the last time in NFL history we saw a wrong number situation pop up during the NFL draft. I did a video about the Cleveland Browns falling victim to this in 1979, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But it's still insane either way. And what's crazy is that I dug high and low, and I couldn't find anything about whether or not the actual John Holland ever got in contact with Don Shula beforehand. Remember, this was the early 70s we were talking about here. You didn't have players being represented by big-time agents. You didn't have different access points to get to a player. If you had the wrong number on a guy, it's not like you could easily find the right number. You were completely screwed. I don't think Don Shula was able to get that pre-Super Bowl and even that Super Bowl visit with the John Holland he was looking for, especially because Holland was playing in the Senior Bowl the day before. If that phone call was correct, and the two men vibe well, and Shula liked Holland, then maybe the Dolphins take Holland early on, and take the man you've been watching this entire time, and never take Nat Moore since they already addressed their receiver need early on. Instead, history changed forever, all because Don Shula had the wrong number and tried to draft a 35-year-old steelworker who didn't have football experience and would have been the oldest NFL pick of all time and probably the dumbest pick in NFL history. As a side note, to learn about the real oldest pick in NFL history, click the card in the upper right corner. And the Dolphins might have dodged a bullet with this and by getting the wrong number, because the Dolphins ended up passing on Holland, as he went to the team that lost the Super Bowl to them, getting taken by the Minnesota Vikings in the second round with pick number 29. To learn about that Super Bowl, click the card in the upper right corner. His NFL career was much ado about nothing. He only played one season with the Vikings, and then spent the next 3 seasons with the Buffalo Bills before never playing in the NFL midway through the 1977 season. Holland's final stat line in the league was just 35 catches for 634 yards and 3 touchdowns. And with the Vikings, as in the team that drafted him, he never found the end zone and had just 5 catches for 84 yards. For a top 30 pick, that's not good in the slightest bit. And to say that Nat Moore had a better career than John Holland would be like saying Minecraft has more daily users than the point-and-click game your buddy made in high school coding class that he got an F on. Heck, John Holland, the 35-year-old steelworker that Don Shula accidentally called up, did about as much in the NFL as the Tennessee State wideout of the same name. One wrong number and one awkward phone call might have legitimately changed NFL history forever. And I do not say that lightly, seeing as the difference between who Don Shula wanted and who he ended up getting was like night and day. Today, we're not going to see a scenario like this play out with the man you've been watching this whole time in John Holland. The whole process is much more streamlined, and there are a million points of contact to get to a player or someone close to him if you want. Plus, with everything today, it's very tough to confuse a prospective NFL player with a 35-year-old steelworker, even if both have the same name and happen to reside in the same town despite having no relation with each other. But in 1974, one phone call gone wrong might have saved the Dolphins from drafting a bust. Or one phone call could have led to the Dolphins accidentally drafting the oldest player ever. Who's to say what would have gone down? Either way, when it came to the Miami Dolphins, and the man you've been watching this whole time in John Holland, the craziest part of his NFL career wasn't about any of the teams he played for, but rather the team he didn't play for. Be sure to like and subscribe if you have not done so already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and check out my other channels, JG8 for the history of college football, JG7 for the history of baseball, and JG9 News, where we talk about all things happening in the NFL. Join me every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play live NFL trivia for cash prizes. And make sure to join me live, as we're on stream just about every single day. And thanks to all our Patreon members and our YouTube members for helping out the channel. See how you become a member and show your support financially in the description down below.